Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'd like to welcome you all to this event. My name is Peter Kukuska from the Foundation of Global Governance and Sustainability, known as FOGS, and I'm the project manager for this event, Floods, Wildfires, Pandemics. Is it time to call in the troops? This event is sponsored by FOGS and NATO's Public Diplomacy Division. At the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability, we appreciate the role that military personnel and equipment can play and have already been playing in areas struck by national, natural, or human-made disasters ranging from pandemics, like the current COVID-19 one, to floods, forest fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, and industrial accidents like oil spills. We believe that such use of military assets within countries and across borders has to be highlighted for policymakers, and the public can be further improved on the basis of best practices that can and need to be collected and shared broadly. The role of NATO for the coordination of large-scale cross-border operations, as well as for standard setting and capacity building among a significant number of national militaries, is central to all of this. Alongside other organizations, notably the United Nations, that provides the global normative framework for such activities. For this event, we started with a background paper, Use of Military Resources to Address Natural and Human-Made Disasters. And this forms a part of this project, Militaries for Civilian Emergencies Project, the M4CE Project. We then conducted interviews with key actors and stakeholders, some of which are now going to take part in this event as our distinguished panelists. We will have the opportunity for Q&As, and we'll also be asking our audiences to take part in some of our polling activities throughout. To start off, I'd like to introduce our two co-moderators. First of all, Lauren Brennan. Lauren Brennan joined FOGS in February this year, initially as a trainee and subsequently as junior policy advisor to conduct policy research on the role of militaries and civilian emergencies and on the promotion of the Sustainable Development Goals. Recently, she completed her studies of the double MA in International Affairs and a Master of Science in Environment, Politics and Development from the Johns Hopkins Bologna Center. In addition, she has experience working on issues related to civic engagement, economic justice, and climate action with organizations such as AmeriCorps, the World Group Bank, and the Australian Greens. Welcome, Lauren. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Yvonne Rademacher. Yvonne serves as Senior Global Governance Advisor at FOGS. Yvonne holds a PhD in Disaster Science and Management with a focus on community disaster assets. She has 20 years of extensive work experience in civil conflicts and international disaster management, mainly with the UN, the OCSE, and in numerous emergency response operations around the world. Her research interest covers the identification and activation of community disaster management assets, governance structures and linkages between institutional emergency management, civil society, and the public sector, as well as a conceptual and operational nexus between disaster management and climate change. Thank you, Yvonne. Without any more further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to Lauren.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yes, hi. I would like to first introduce our very first panelist, Dr. William C. Banks. Dr. William Banks is a Syracuse University College of Law Board of Advisors, distinguished professor and emeritus professor at the College of Law and the Maxwell School as Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs. In addition, Mr. Banks is the founding director of the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism at Syracuse University. Dr. Banks is the co-author to leading books in the field of national security and terrorism, including Soldiers on the Home Front, The Domestic Role of the American Military, Harvard 2016 with Stephen Dykes. He currently serves as the chair of the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on Law and National Security.
Our next panelist is Mr. David Burke. Mr. David Burke is the current Chief Programs Officer at Team Rubicon, an international non-governmental organization specializing in disaster response based in California, the United States. In this role, Mr. Burke oversees the strategy, development, and execution of Team Rubicon's disaster service programs. In addition to his role at Team Rubicon, Mr. Burke has served on the boards of national voluntary organizations active in disasters and the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation, where he served as the board president. Prior to his move to the nonprofit space, David served nearly 5 years in the Marine Corps as a logistics officer, deployed to Iraq with RCT-8 and to Afghanistan with the 2nd Marine Division, separating from active service as a captain. Thank you for joining us.
And next up, we have Mr. Nelson Castano joining us. An expert in civil military relations and humanitarian assistance, Mr. Nelson Castano is the current Manager of Operations Coordination at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in the Disasters, Climate, and Crisis Department in Geneva. Prior to this role, Mr. Castano served in many high-level positions, including as head of the Pan American Disaster Response Unit in Panama, Regional Disaster Management Coordinator for South Asia, Regional Urban and DRR Coordinator for the Americas, and Head of Disaster and Crisis Prevention, Response and Recovery for Asia Pacific based in Kuala Lumpur. He also worked with the Colombian Red Cross for nearly 21 years. Welcome, Mr. Nelson Castano.
Also joining us today is Mr. Craig Fugate. Both at the national and federal level, Mr. Fugate has been at the forefront of disaster preparedness. Most recently, Mr. Fugate was appointed by former President Barack Obama to serve as the administrator of the US Federal Emergency Management, FEMA, agency. Agency FEMA. In this role from 2009 to 2017, Mr. Fugate oversaw the federal government's response to many severe natural disasters. Prior to this role, Mr. Fugate served as the Florida Director for the Emergency Management Division, launching the largest mutual aid response to affected states in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Craig Fugate is the current Chief Emergency Resilience Officer at One Concern. Thank you for joining us.
Next up, we have Dr. Jorgos Castacos. Dr. Jorgos Castacos is co-founder and executive director of FOGS. About half of his 30-year work experience has been with the UN, including with the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, the high-level panel on global sustainability, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. He has witnessed civil-military cooperation firsthand in several of his UN field missions during the mid-1990s, including in Haiti and Bosnia, and has served in the army of his native Greece as part of the compulsory military service. He is a mechanical engineer by training and has a PhD in international relations, specializing in global governance, sustainability, and resilience. Welcome.
Completing our panel today is Mr. Nicos Vetzios. Mr. Nicos Vetzios has recently retired from the Greek Armed Forces, where he served with distinction as an army officer, retiring at the rank of Brigadier General. Among the high-level positions that Mr. Vetzios occupied in the past were that of the Section Head, Intelligence Plans and Policies at NATO Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, and of the International Relations Director at the Ministry of National Defense in Athens, Greece. In this role, Mr. Vetzios was responsible for international defense cooperation and the development of the Ministry of Defense policy concerning NATO and the European Union. Thank you for joining us today. So now we are moving on to the next part, where I'm just going to give a brief context overview of how this project actually sits in international disaster management. So I don't want to say too much here because we have precious time in this hour plus, and it's really meant for a discussion among our fantastic panel members. I just wanted to put into context why we're talking about military assets in civilian emergencies. And this M4CE project has to be understood in the larger context of how disaster management is evolving. So I wanted to share with you Let me see, my screen sharing is disabled, so I can't show it to you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it. It's a statistics. I thought we should incorporate some figures here. So on this slide that I was going to show you, I was going to explain that over the last 50 years, we have gotten much better at reducing the human cost of disasters, and that is the number of reported death has been cut by almost 1/3. That is a significant achievement of the disaster management community. So the actual number of human death has been reduced, but at the same time, during that same period, the number of reported disasters has increased significantly by more than 4 times, and the economic cost by almost 8 times. So we also know from climate models that we can expect these statistical trends to grow exponentially. So you can see that to deal with this, we will have to find assets. So while we are seeing this increase here, the institutional setup and processes of disaster management have not kept up with these drastic changes and challenges. The focus has remained on disaster reactive response instead of proactive preparedness, mitigation, and adaptation. We know from historical events that governments can fall over a poorly managed disaster. Thus, governments are now under enormous pressure to deliver to their citizens and constituencies. We just have to look at the devastation caused by floods and wildfires over this past year alone. Governments seemed caught off guard, and citizens were frustrated with a poor response and assistance. So the question is now, where to find more resources to meet this ever-increasing need? To manage more and more severe disasters, we urgently need resources in terms of human resources, experts, technical staffs, volunteers, equipment, and of course, money. So the search is on where to find additional resources and assets to meet this incredible demand. Military assets are one obvious place to look. This is what this project is about, to find out if more use can be made of military assets. This is where we are in this. So the point of today's debate is to advance this discussion. Can we have a closer look at what is holding back the use of military assets? And where do our experts see solutions to any of these obstacles that governments and international regional organizations must address without further delay? And with this, I'm handing over back to Lauren, who is going to tell us a little bit more about the findings of the M4CE project to date and to start the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. I think just really briefly to bring us to where we are today. As per the project we've been working on, we produced this background research paper, which you can now find on fogs.org. Which initially began with broad desk review, examining 8 country-level case studies to identify the country's legislative framework for using armed forces for civil protection, the presence of key civilian authorities, which armed force branches were involved, and any good practices. So in this research, we found several commonalities amongst countries, including what we viewed as a general trend of increased number of military assets being used for civilian emergencies. And this, of course, was underscored during COVID-19. But what also had arisen were country-specific issues, which led us to devise a list of follow-up questions or concerns. We dove deeper into these research questions and interviewed 8 experts in this topic, all from diverse backgrounds representing the government, civil society, the military, the private sector, and so on. And for your reference, you can also watch all of these full-length videos on our BOGS YouTube channel. But ultimately, the resounding message of these interviews was clear, that the frequency and the cost of disasters is only increasing. And as we listened to each of these interviews, we were reminded over again that the coordination of military and civilian authorities working side by side is not only a logistical challenge, but it's a question of legitimacy, accountability, and safety. So overall, these rich and conversations have really highlighted the urgency for clarity in these 3 specific areas that will guide today's panel. So first, we see policy frameworks and budget as a clear issue. Second, the architecture and operational effectiveness of international coordination mechanisms. And thirdly, perceptions, and public opinion. So today we'd like to continue these conversations, carry these forward in the public space with the questions that are posed here at this panel. So once again, thank you all for being here today. So without further ado, I think we can jump into our very first theme, as I mentioned, which is policy frameworks and budget. So as we know, the legal frameworks on the use of the military for civilian emergency response vary from country to country. So a key issue then arises is who ends up making operational decisions and who is going to pay for the deployment of military assets. So let's think about this in terms of a beloved American restaurant that we may all know is the Waffle House. Craig, if you can please explain further, when a disaster strikes and everyone meets in the Waffle House, who decides who will pay? But most importantly, who is the one making waffles?
Well, the Waffle House is a restaurant in the United States. It's primarily in the Southeast where we have a lot of hurricanes and they've had a lot of disasters to prepare for. They're generally one of the first places to get open. But it's an interesting intersection of the private sector, government response, and in the United States where we have the military in a dual role status. They can either be under the president, under federal duty. We call that Title 10. It's the definition of the federal code, or they could be in state active duty under the governors. And so Waffle Houses, because they're open, they're again, part of the process of getting communities back up. They're also a good indicator of how heavily impacted areas are. And so as a quick example of how we've used it before, a lot of people spend a lot of time assessing and determining how bad a disaster is before they make a decision to respond. And what you'll find is you never get time back in disasters. And so in Florida and at FEMA, we responded like it was bad. We would send resources in before we had the first assessments. And when you're going into a hurricane, damages can be hundreds of miles across. And you'll start seeing damages, but you're not sure if you're in the area of heavy impact yet. And the Waffle House was a good indicator. We came up with a little index. If they're open and had a full menu, keep going, it's not that bad. If you get there and they're open, but they have a limited menu, you probably have had power outages and a lot of what we would basically refer to as mass care requirements, but not in the area where search and rescue or security missions need to be implemented. But if you got to an area where the Waffle House was closed because of the disaster, you're now on the fringes of where the heavy impacts are, and that's where your team should go to work. And again, it gave us a way to leverage a restaurant that doesn't close unless they're forced to close by a disaster as an indicator of, are we there yet?
Dr. Banks, I'm wondering if you would like to join this part of the discussion about the legislative framework. Who is in charge of making waffles, right? So how can we look at this from different angles? Obviously, different countries, even in the US, different states have different approaches to emergency management. What are some of the legislative issues that you see that are either defining a response or holding it back? Where do you see the big issues in legislation and policy?
That's a very good question, and I'm pleased to be with you today. For one moment, let me just continue with Craig Fugate's metaphor. One good response would be to build more Waffle Houses throughout the United States and perhaps around the world. As a barometer, I think his notion there is practically a really excellent one. On the legal side, the part of the reason that you're doing this project, of course, is that every society has its own, what you might think of as rules of the game. And the rules of the game are legislative, but they're also, in a pre-legislative sense, they're constitutional. So every nation has its own charter. Ours in the United States is pretty unique, and it owes a lot to our history of separating from England and so on. And that's not important for our considerations today, but it is important to recognize that the role of the military in disaster response is going to be determined in the first instance by the constitutional parameters that each country offers for its military. in these times, modern times, looking at your data about the incidence of disasters and the growing costs of them, even if we are able to bring the sort of per incident number of casualties down, the cost of disaster and the frequency of disasters is, of course, etching up steadily. And in some respects, it's etching up dramatically. Certainly in the United States, Craig Fugate's tenure in Florida, even before he became director of FEMA, I'm surprised that he was able to sleep because the frequency of disasters and the need for response there was just quite dramatic. One of the things that Craig did in Florida that is an illustration of how nations can cooperate in disaster response using military resources is that he exercised an interstate mechanism that we have in the United States. Legally, the device is called the compact. As you all know, a compact is just a form of agreement. And our Constitution, remarkably enough, given the history, allows for compacts between states to share resources to respond to problems that transcend geographic borders. Most problems do, of course, cross borders. Borders are political ideas. They have nothing to do with the physical world. And so it's a good model, I think, for cooperation across nations as well. We can agree. And so long as the constitutional mechanisms are there to permit the military to participate in cooperative agreements, they are in the United States. They would be in most, I think probably all the nations that are represented in this program here today. Then military can be brought to bear, and it can be brought for the reasons that Yvonne and Lauren and Peter detailed in their opening remarks. The military has more resources, better training, more people, and a bigger budget than any other entities in any of our societies. We have to take advantage of the best resourced and most expert training. There's a risk, and the risk also exists in the United States, but in other nations as well, that military might abuse its authorities, that they might become martial rather than responsive. But that counts on good training, adherence to mission, the unity of command between civilian and military leadership. And if those mechanisms can be arranged through compacts or other entities, we've had a lot of experience doing that here in the United States, then the military can be brought in more seamlessly. Then the soldiers are not fighting to win wars. They're saving lives and protecting property and restoring services where disasters occur. Maybe that's enough from me for now.
Thank you so much for this. And I'm inviting anybody to continue us on this tangent here. Obviously, some countries are more inclusive of the military than others. We, in our research at Fox here, we're looking at India versus Germany, a little bit more hesitant to use military assets as opposed to India, for example. One of the questions that we were looking at is how responsive has been the legislative or the policy frameworks in each country to actually really take notice of these increasing demands over time, and is the legislation and the policies keeping up with the changed environment that might need to invite more military assets? So, for example, in the United States, has there been an instance where recent legislation has actually opened up more opportunities for the military to be engaged or not? Nelson, I'm also looking at you and Jorgos, you know, where can you see an example maybe where have we remained stagnant in legislation and policy that we need to look at, or is there some movement? Jorgos.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thanks, everybody. This in Germany, we discussed it, and it happens to be your home country, right? And of course, there is a past there from the Second World War, or even before that. People are afraid of giving too much power to the military to intervene, and I understand it is in the basic law, etc., the Constitution, that limits the use of the military. At the same time, we can see now that in Germany, in Japan, the militaries are allowed, even by court decisions, interpretations of the law, to be sent abroad for humanitarian operations. So there is de facto, I think, a loosening up of legal frameworks and also of people vis-a-vis the militaries, when you see that they are helping and they don't have any other bad intention or whatever. In my home country, Greece, we had a dictatorship also not that far ago, until from 67 to 74. Again, then you can see with suspicion a military deploying. Mr. Vetzios can tell us also afterwards. But at the same time, nowadays, I think as long as you see it as a part of the public sector, that it is knowledgeable, equipped, and has the budget and the willingness to intervene in such situations, you can only welcome them. But there have always to be some a framework within which this all happens. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, definitely, for example, Germany is looking at its constitution and its policies. So there is, for sure, there is a look at changes that might need to take place. Maybe also let's look at the other angle we were trying to cover with this question, is the issue of financing and funding, money to who will pay for the military, right? This is always an ongoing issue. If you invite military assistance, who will pay for that? Would anybody have an example of where that might have been an issue? Craig, I see you.
Yeah, in the United States, when the states call up the National Guard, which are Army Reserve or Air Force Reserve in a state that could go under the command of the governor, the state's obligated to pay for that. And it's very expensive. So states often will not call up their guard unless they see a way to get reimbursed. And they'll a lot of times ask for federal funding. And this is where FEMA comes in disaster declarations. Congress sets aside a large sum of money for FEMA to pay for and reimburse the cost of military support. So if the governor calls out the National Guard and it reaches the threshold where the president's declared a disaster, FEMA will reimburse, but only a percentage of that, 75%, is the minimum amount. Rarely does it go higher. The same for the active duty, the Department of Defense. If they are tasked by FEMA in a disaster response, FEMA will then reimburse the Department of Defense for those expenses as we've agreed to out of that fund. So it's not necessarily FEMA's money as much as it's a federal fund for disaster response that can reimburse states or reimburse the Department of Defense in those missions. So by and large, for most disasters, that mechanism already existed in the United States, but it does cause a problem when states call out the Guard or would like to call out the Guard where there's not federal funding. Many states do not have the budget to be able to bring up their National Guard for a long duration. And so they're usually looking for another way to pay for that or another resource.
Definitely a good point. And I think that is the same in other countries. We've seen in our research that there could be a delay in the deployment of resources if there's hesitance who has to pay for it, right? Or in the aftermath. So I think what we would like to cover here is also the question of how these regional agreements, how effective are they really? Because we have policies for assistance in place, but sometimes the response might not be as was agreed, right? This is another policy framework that is questionable in how far that really supports effectiveness of military deployment. Nelson, sorry, I see your hand, please.
No, thank you. But I saw before Nicos raised his hand. Do you want to say something before?
Yes, just to talk about the budget and who covers the budget when the military is involved. In Greece, and contrary like from the US, it's cost-free for the state. So everything is charged to the armed forces. Maybe only 5 or 10% is reimbursed, but usually whenever we use our means, personnel, equipment, everything is on the defense budget. So it's completely different. It is not so good from our side. Thank you. Oh, no. Yeah.
No, thank you. Allow me to be a little bit provocative, inviting the colleagues to see or to allow me to present another perspective. No, it's important to know the experience of countries like US, Japan, Germany, but in the diversity that we are facing now, high-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries, we need to see that context by context, okay? When different multinational forces are supporting other countries like Philippines, let's come back to Haiyan operation, okay? In Haiyan operation, more or less, more than 15 countries deploy military assets to support Philippines, okay? And the number of assets and the level of the investment and the money, the cost of those international deployment was huge for 1, 2, 3 months intervention, when Haiyan operation was for 2 years. I don't want to say, I am not ready to say that when we are talking about budget, we need to see also the value for money, okay? The value for money is the cost of the deployment versus the impact that we are providing in the country affected, okay? When we are talking also about legislation, yes, it's country by country. In medium or low income countries, we see that the national systems are not in the position, or they don't have the budget to cover the cost of the military assets, even in the domestic response. And the Minister of Defense or whoever else should cover the cost, because in some cases, the national disaster management authorities they don't have the funds to cover the cost. That's why the international assistance is so important in several cases. The support from USAID VHA now, the support from ECHO, the support from SIDA Canada is also important. And the private sector now is playing an important role when we are talking about funding, when we are talking about financial issues. Regarding to legislation, the diversity is huge. It's huge. And I think it's important for the military bodies, entities like NATO, to go to the analysis that others are doing about what is the status of the different legal frameworks at national level, regional level. Because the legislation, the regional agreement in ASEAN, AHA Center, is very specific for 11 countries like Singapore, Malaysia, more or less medium income countries. But when we are comparing the capacity of AHA Center, ASEAN, with CEPREDENAC in Central America, you will see the diversity. And it's important to map or to have better understanding about the different legal frameworks. And the most important is the opportunities in how to support the country before the disaster happens, how to support the countries in updating the legal frameworks, in making sure that the elements or components related to the interaction between civilians and militaries is very well reflected, because in several cases, legislation in some countries are very old, 20 or 30 years old, and you don't see in the legal framework any single reference about the role of the military bodies. So we need to invest before the disaster, enhancing the knowledge and capacity and helping the governments in updating the legal frameworks according to the new trends and realities. Over. Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I know Dr. Banks has to depart early here. So I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Banks, any If you want to respond to Nelson or provide any last thoughts on urgent actions or next steps coming ahead from you.
There we go. Thank you. These are excellent comments. You know, I think what's been demonstrated so far, starting with the Waffle House and continuing through ideas about payment, is that that involving the military significantly in disaster preparedness and response requires cooperation. It's cooperation across civilian agencies. It's between civilian agencies and the military. And that cooperation has to be manifest with exercises and training. In the United States, the situation has been improved dramatically in the last 20 years or so by those two things, and by the leadership of individuals like Craig Fugate, who've managed to get it done. That is, being willing. We have something called unity of command in our system, which requires civilian and military leadership to work together. In our system, military have to be always subordinate to civilian control. But that subordinance is through a cooperative agreement where the military voices are heard alongside the civilians in deciding how to operationalize preparedness and response. Only one other point, while the Waffle House, I think, remains an excellent metaphor, as you all know, these days many crises will emerge and become real more quickly than a Waffle House can make a waffle. That is, in a virtual world, take a look at ransomware attacks, for example, or other cyber intrusions that can cause tremendous disruption, if not destruction, of infrastructure across civilian society. They can occur in the blink of an eye. So we need pre-positioned agreements and forces that will be able to respond. And in the United States and in other societies, military assets are also very vulnerable and very valuable in a digital world, and helping to anticipate and manage ransomware and other cyber crises before they can spin out of control. We had one this past spring in the United States called Colonial Pipeline, which was on the verge of becoming a major disaster. Because the company and some other responders were a little bit late in catching up with the scope of the problem that was unfolding with the availability of fuel supplies and the like in the United States. So Waffles works most of the time, but not always in the virtual world. So many thanks for asking me to join you.
Allow me to jump in at the moment. We're going to go and ask our kind audience. We have a poll, and we would like to just see if we can grab a pulse indication of how our audience is thinking. So we have a question for all those viewing. So feel free to respond to: who should be used as the ultimate decision maker when you call in the troops? So I'm going to give you all another 10 to 15 seconds to answer. There's no right or wrong answer at this stage. So okay, last couple of seconds. Okay, so I'm going to go now, and we've nearly got everyone's response. Okay, I'm going to share those results to see what our audience thinks. So I'm going to hand over back to Lauren. Maybe you want to take this up further. Thank you to all those that answered, and we'll have a few more polls later on.
Thanks, everyone. So yeah, moving on to our next theme. This will be, we'll start off in pointing to you, Jorgos and Nelson, on architecture and operational effectiveness of international coordination mechanisms. So with the current surge of disasters, pandemics, and human-made emergencies expected to only worsen in the upcoming years, we urgently need to reconfigure international and regional cooperation on disaster management. So from your perspective, looking at the current operational effectiveness or lack thereof, how do you see the future and evolving role of the UN, NATO, and the EU in helping to coordinate military assistance in non-conflict disasters? And if you can explain further, what concrete steps need to be taken to make them more functional?
That's what you want to start, right? Start with her.
May I go? Or George? No, over to you. Do you want to go ahead?
Okay, if you don't mind, because you know more and you can comment better, I think, on what I say, perhaps. I can just say a few things. I'm not a disaster expert, but more from a global governance perspective, what I see, and resilience perspective, what I see is that, of course, we want the response to an emergency to happen at the closest level to the emergency itself, if it's not already prevented, which is the best thing. And as Yvonne mentioned earlier, if it does happen, then we want the local level to respond and to finish with it, be it a fire or something, right? So that you don't need any external assistance at any other level. And that is really the definition of resilience. At the local level, you can withstand shocks. But if it gets out of hand for some reason, and then you do need that assistance, even across borders, it's good that we have these mechanisms that, for example, in the European Union, there is rescEU, and that part of the European Union that helps, coordinates support to the members of the bloc. There is, of course, the United Nations that sets some standards also for the involvement of militaries in such efforts. For example, the Oslo guidelines, the UN has this normative, right, function at the global level. And for perhaps less developed countries, it can also have a more operational role through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, coordinates in countries the UN system presence, but also other actors can lodge appeals for funding and all these things, right? Also the European Union funds within the EU and outside such operations, but mainly starting from civilian support and coordination, and then going to military if necessary. And of course, NATO is itself a military organization. It has its own way of operation and its own Euro-Atlantic disaster response coordination center, again for its members, and that is directly addressing the militaries and military-civilian cooperation. So there is a lot of variety. Each one of them has its niche operation. What I think is most important, as I said, to avoid major deployments and also the cost that those entail, but to focus on prevention and preparedness. And that can be done and is being done by these organizations through training. It's important to have joint training, right? To have best practices exchanged, to have more clarity on military-civilian cooperation, command structures, explain to citizens the role of the military when they intervene, and to have even joint exercises, which also happen. For example, NATO had a big exercise of this sort in the Balkans, I think, recently. So as we have more need for such operation, such responses, we see the organizations standing up to this. But of course, there are also problems of coordination, specialization. Somehow the UN sometimes, Mr. Castano may want to tell us, I see it's becoming the implementation mechanism of the European Union because money comes from the European Union. And sometimes we see the UN overemphasizing its operational role, while it should not probably, or branches of the UN, just to be able to absorb resources from the European Union that are for humanitarian and disaster relief causes. Thank you for now.
No, complimenting you. I love the way that you started the conversation highlighting resilience as an important concept, okay? And looking from the localization perspective. how to increase the capacity of the local actors and the national actors. I think NATO, EU, so many entities and governments like US through USAID, Canada through CIDA are now looking how, in addition to develop the capacity to deploy and to respond internationally, they are looking how to invest more at national level and local level. From the civil and military relation perspective or coordination perspective, I think it's so important to identify what is the right balance between the level of the investment that we are doing, developing the huge capacity to respond to other countries outside your respective countries, and how we are ready to invest at domestic level. Let me say one practical thing. Many countries need to institutionalize civil and military coordination. As institutionalize means making sure that it's part of the legal frameworks, it's part of the regular programming, it's part of the development of the national disaster management system. It's not because somebody is coming from outside to talk about civil and military coordination, and that's all. That we need to support the governments at domestic level in how to institutionalize civil and military coordination in the regular programs and plans. And that implies, as my colleague said, to establish proper cooperation, preparedness, prevention, activities, joint planning, information sharing, many activities before the disaster happened, establishing the cooperation and coordination platform before the disaster happened. Okay? And another thing that the institutionalization at domestic level will help a lot is to increase the awareness and working together to identify when and how to prioritize the deployment of military and civil defense assets. In addition, the investment at domestic level will help us also to improve the knowledge and to identify the issues about the interoperability between civilians and military bodies. Interoperability, because the National Disaster Management Agency, managed by civilians, they have their own system, procedures in how to operate. But the military bodies have their own discipline, structure, how to make sure that, talking about efficiency, the interoperability is very well understood and is allowing us to optimize the resources that we have in case of disaster. But we need to invest more before. And regarding to the architecture, yes, we have so many entities at global level managing or promoting the civil and military coordination agenda, but we need to see how the regional systems, like I said, AHA Center, CEPREDENAC, SARC, SADC in South Africa, the Arctic Council now, which is a new particular regional mechanisms, are integrating and ready to receive and interact with the military bodies. Let me use the hurricane seasons in the Caribbean region, okay? Traditionally has been US one of the main partners deploying military assets. But 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the most affected islands were the British Virgin Islands. And US and UK should deploy from UK military assets to support the overseas branches at the Caribbean region. And we have next to them the US military assets ready to support. It means pre-agreement before are important. But we need to understand how the sub-regional systems are ready or not ready to interact with this international deployment. And also in Bahamas, very small country, very low capacity. The capacity of the military bodies was very limited. At the same for the National Disaster Management Authority. CDEMA, the sub-regional system, was the one providing the support And OCHA deployed also the resources, but SEDEMA say, no, it's SEDEMA now, the entity, the regional system, with the authority on behalf of the government of Bahamas to facilitate the coordination. And the structure of the resources from UN, OCHA, UNDAC, whatever, should be integrated into the sub-regional system. It means it's important to map the different sub-regional systems, the different structures in place, and also to have more discussions about issues about interoperability. Thank you.
If I may jump in here, this is very interesting because Jorgos talked about local resilience. You have highlighted the importance for international disasters, for regional agreements. And in a way, it points back to when we look at the deployment of military resources, also for cultural reasons, to keep it in the region and not deploy from one continent to another, perhaps military assets that might not be understood in other parts of the world, right? So there is an extra layer of sensitivity when we're looking at military assets anyway, but when we use them in an international context.
I think we might have lost Yvonne for a second. I think, let me see. She comes back. But no, thank you so much. I think sharing what Jorgos and Nelson both shared on the topic of resilience and with the specific case studies. Thank you so much for sharing. And maybe Peter, in the meantime, should we do a poll, and then we can, if we don't hear back from Yvonne, we can move to the next theme.
I see Yvonne's back.
No, it's perfect.
Oh, yeah,
I was going to hand over to you anyway, but Peter had another poll question here before we run out of time. So maybe Peter wants to do another poll before we look at public perception. It really ties into this discussion now, because in the end, even policy legislative frameworks, they need to be supported by the public, right? In the end, it is how communities receive assistance and how they view it. So Peter, over to you.
Sure. Let's go to our next question. So here we've got a choice of three. When should militaries be called in for emergencies? Never, as a last resort, or upon the request of a designated lead agency? If you had a bigger budget, you would have won a car for the right answer.
An electric car, we hope, or
of course, green fuel, hydrogen. I don't know. A couple more seconds.
This is a fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time.
Okay, I'm going to give everyone a couple more seconds to answer, and I'm closing the poll shortly. And here are the results. So maybe Lauren or Yvonne, I don't know if you'd like to take this further, but thank you to all those that polled.
Thanks, everyone. So yeah, for our very last theme, as Yvonne said, I wish we had much more time to discuss these themes, but I'd like to now turn to David and Nicos, so on perceptions and public opinion. So public perception and opinion vary from country to country on the use of military assets. For instance, with countries with ongoing civil conflict or with a complicated history of abuse of power, they're more hesitant to use the military in civilian disaster management. So if we can agree more military assets are needed to manage disasters, what do we need to do to change the public perception, and how? So I know that's a heavy question, but maybe we'll start with you, David, and Nicos, if you want to respond after.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everybody. Privileged to be here with the group today. So I think we can agree today that the use of military assets are a necessity to respond to what Yvonne was covering at the start here. I'd be remiss to not say imagining a world where we had capacity and resources beyond military assets would be a little short-sighted from what we see in global climate change, what we see in the opportunity or need of peoples across the world. But what we've invested in as a global community is nearly $2 trillion a year in militaries. So we have this massive resource that can truly answer needs of people that are suffering. But to much of what Nelson's covered today, the context and the location is incredibly important to understand what militaries can be useful. A resource that's not accepted is no longer a useful resource. What Team Rubicon has seen as maybe one of the largest volunteer organizations comprised of mostly military veterans is even former military members face perception challenges with local agencies, with the humanitarian sector, and with local populations. So, there's no way to solve this without significant training and exercise and awareness, ideally at the regional level, so that militaries can be accepted more effectively. But I think the ultimate opportunity really lies in how do we find the way to liberate some of that military funding to build humanitarian capacity, to increase resilience, increase disaster risk reduction investments around the world, and see how we can reduce the reliance on the military asset and build some capacity elsewhere. Until that can happen, military investments represent some of the most incredible human resource investments around the world, and some of the most skilled people that have experience in hard environments that can truly make a difference in a disaster setting. So, for perhaps decades to come, we'll see huge value from militaries and former military members that have received huge training, huge investments from their countries, and experiences that are nearly unmatched in other professions that are very applicable to humanitarian emergencies. So I think it's a pretty big topic, but a lot of opportunity to leverage our militaries and our former military members.
So, I continue. Finished, David? Yeah. Okay. So, hi, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Last year, it was published an opinion poll with the institution that the Greek society trusts more. So, the armed forces was the most trustworthy institution in the country, with 69% of the population expressed high degree of trust. At the two last position, just for your information, were the mass media and, unfortunately, the NGOs, with 13 and 12% of trust, respectively. So the question that comes in mind, it was always like that? Definitely no. As Jorgos mentioned it, we had the military coup in the 70s, and the armed forces for more than 2 decades were not very popular among the public opinion. Next question is, what happened to increase their popularity? Which was the reason for this change? Since all these years, there was no armed conflict that the Greek armed forces involved. The main factor, according to my opinion, that could have influenced this change was the extended non-military role of the Greek armed forces all these years. They were, and they are, of course, participated in all kinds of disasters: floods, wildfires, earthquakes, pandemic now. Also, the Greek armed forces regularly assist the civilian structures, like, for example, by undertaking responsibility for patient airlifts from isolated islands with the use of military helicopters and aircraft, construction of utility projects and public works projects in small isolated villages, repairing of schools, repairing of damaged roads, and many more. Now, if this involvement is effective or better cost effective, is another story, another discussion. For example, how effective is to use a high performance specialized military helicopter for medical airlift? That could be done better and much more cheaper for the state by medical helicopter. So, but it's for another panel, another moment. However, the bottom line is that the result from this non-military engagement of the armed forces were very positive and has achieved to change the almost negative public opinion to a very positive one. Now, is this good for the armed forces? Okay, our armed forces are a separate organization. They have their own organization culture. It's good for the society, it's good for the state, but for the armed forces, yes, it is good. It's very good. Again, according to my opinion, for many reasons, but mainly because the defense budget is a democratic state, is subject of public opinion acceptance. We could not maintain one of the largest defense budgets in NATO. We're stable above 2% of the GDP without having the public's opinion support. So everyone is happy? It's a win-win situation? No, not exactly. You see, there is skepticism among many militaries for the use of the army, for this use of the army. The armed forces' first objective is to defend the country. Okay, there is no doubt on that. But which is their second objective? Is the preparation for the war or the non-military and involvement in civilian emergencies? For many people, military people is preparing for war. And very frequently, they see the non-military role as a distraction. Questions like, why are between the frontliners at the civilian emergencies, since there are dedicated structures for the job, are frequently asked. It is different to be the last resort, nobody will complain, from being every time a front runner on top of all the tasks and objectives that you have to accomplish. This leads to personnel and equipment overload. Therefore, it is widespread among the armed forces personnel the perception that this is not their job, and they see the support of the civil authorities as a zero-sum game with their real mission. Concluding, I want to underline that except the public perception, we need to consider the military perception too. It is important to convince the armed forces personnel that what they are doing, it matters. Internal strategic communication to convince the military personnel is necessary if we foresee extended use of military personnel and equipment in a civilian emergency in the future. And of course, this should be followed by two important actions. Create specialized units like engineers and medicals that they will have the non-military role as a second objective in their mission. Train and equip them for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicos. David, can I throw this back at you here? I mean, obviously, we're just looking at, yes, military resources, good idea. But from the perspective of the military, how open is, for example, the US military in actually getting engaged in civilian disasters? Would it be the same or would it be different?
I think Nicos brings up a perfect point that the military perspective is equally as important as humanitarians and populations. In the US, from day one, military members are trained that humanitarian operations are an element of the full spectrum of their job. So in my time in the Marine Corps, that was part of introductory courses in the Marine Corps, in the United States Marine Corps, that humanitarian operations were an element that you may be called upon to exercise the skills and capacities built by that unit. So that I think helps significantly in the military perception of their role and their potential role and the benefit to whatever part of the world they're operating in. So that is a specific training point that helps break down any perception risk. I think one of the things that came to mind as we tie together some of these, and maybe it ties all the way back even to the legislative changes that we're seeing in countries, our military invests significantly in our human resources, our training, and the pandemic highlighted something that we hadn't seen before, where the idea of the state-to-state compacts in the United States were very challenging to exercise because every state was experiencing resource constraint in the same types of resources. The US military trains a lot of medical providers. Many of those medical providers transition into the civilian world without a civilian credential because the states are very particular about their credentialing systems. That's completely understandable. And it's a very entrenched perspective that those credentials are more challenging to cross state lines. Well, the legislature picked up this topic and said, there's military members that taxpayers have already invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in and moved to rapidly credential so that we could better respond to the pandemic and the health systems that were, operating at 200 or 300% capacity across the country. And we saw that make some actual progress in our legislature, but also in the use of the military veteran resources that can add value in these emergencies. Unfortunately, it often takes that scope and scale of disaster to move legislation and move policy forward that can help leverage those resources. But I do think it's a positive outcome to see that skill base being utilized in these events more effectively.
Interesting. Nicos, I wanted to go back to your description of specialized units in public perception. I think this is a really important a point, right? Sometimes to overcome some of the public's hesitance in accepting military assistance, would it be helpful, and Nelson, also to you the question, and Craig, to you too, Jorgos, would it be helpful for militaries to have specialized units that the public can identify? I mean, I think in the US, you don't have that much of a problem there with the military, but in other countries where you do, would it be helpful for the public to actually clearly identify a specialized unit of the military and know what they are there to do? Would that be helpful to overcome any hesitance?
In Greece, no, it will not be a problem, because the people, the public, are used to see people in uniform helping in civilian and non-military crises. But as you mentioned it, maybe depending on the country, maybe it's good to have a different badge, to have a different hat, different color of a hat, showing that, look, we are here to help. It's different from the bad boys that they are in the camp. It makes sense. Also, but the specialized, again, in our case, is why they are more effective. I have seen mass use of soldiers and military personnel, and their effectiveness was very, very limited, because they were not trained, they had not the proper equipment. They were there just to show the uniform, to familiarize the people and say that the army participated also. Having specialized units with special equipment, we will have the added value and we will have the result that we want. So yes, in my opinion, the specialization and special units is winning in all fronts.
Jorgos.
Yes, our research also at Fox has shown that some countries like Poland, for example, they have a territorial defense force, which is like an additional branch of the military, and they have this kind of more tasks for emergencies. They work with the fire brigade and other such civilian services. There is also, let's say, in the US, Mr. Fugate would know, can tell us more, this Army Corps of Engineers that I keep hearing about whenever there is a disaster, I think, in the US, because they're very good at setting up bridges, etc. And David can also say from his experience. So in Russia, there is a whole ministry of responding to emergencies, a special ministry, which could be the civil defense ministry, which is a bit in between, though, civilian purely and military in terms of organization, hierarchy, etc. So, I mean, there are several solutions provided by different countries. What I think is important, if the militaries also start looking at it as an increasing justification of their role in societies that are hopefully more and more peaceful, and the main, let's say, part of the military's existence is replaced gradually with this kind of new threats to human security. Like also as Fox, we have a proposal for another Security Council for the UN, which is for resilience, Global Resilience Council. I could see these forces more and more, and as a self-interest also of the military to get these additional skills that will eventually also give them professionally as afterwards as veterans, or acceptance by the public, etc. So I think in this country it can be resolved in a different way, but I think the movement would be these specialized units, at least second responsibility to be this humanitarian and civilian emergencies, as Nico said, not the first perhaps, but second is important, so that they know from the start, like it seems they know in the US, that they'll be called in and they get prepared for that. And it's not an additional task. It's part of their duties. If the duty is to keep your citizens safe, just rethink about it a bit more openly, I think. Thanks.
Great. I think public perception is not an easy issue to change. Perception is something that takes time, and obviously, as we started talking about, there has to be consensus on legislation, policy, and other things. All of these things come together to form public opinion and public perception on the use of resources. So I thank you for sharing your thoughts on this particular segment, and I'm handing back over to Lauren now for a wrap up.
Thank you so much, everyone. And as Yvonne said, I'd like to offer the floor now to each of our panelists to invite any final remarks or thoughts on urgent actions or next steps that need to happen. So I'll go around in alphabetical order, and if you can take probably, just due to time, unfortunately, just 2 minutes or less with your responses. So I'm going to kick it off to David first.
Thanks, Lauren. Appreciate the time from the group, and hopefully everyone enjoyed the webinar. I'd say, as a closing thought, I'll stay well under 2 minutes here. Militaries represent some of the most professional, largest capacity organizations around the world. And it would be a shame today and in the coming years not to leverage those resources to ensure we're reducing and alleviating human suffering wherever possible. Military veterans transition from those services around the world with incredible skills that can continue that same role of reducing and alleviating human suffering, and are very effective in difficult environments post-disaster. We've seen that here domestically, and we see that overseas very, very regularly. All of that has to be leveraged and applied, understanding local and regional context systems and coordinating mechanisms. I believe there are significant investments we can make in improving understanding, awareness, and overall effectiveness of those systems. But the military does today represent one of the largest, most quick reaction forces we can see anywhere. And that is the opportunity to ensure it can be integrated effectively, but we chart a path that reduces reliance on military assets. I think the challenge to Jorgos would be, as long as there's armed conflict in the world, military's public perception will be tested. And until we get to the day that there's none, there will be places in the world where the utilization of military resources is challenged. But thank you all, and appreciate being here.
Thank you so much. Next to Nelson, please.
No, thank you. The current realities and trends that the whole system is facing, humanitarian and development system, demand that all the resources available to work together, to be put together, okay? But with clear definition about who is doing what, okay? I fully understand that we need to continue looking the capabilities of the military assets as an opportunity to increase the efficiency of the humanitarian response. But there is a need for increasing the awareness and understanding about who is doing what, and also how to make sure that in some cases, the military bodies are not forced to operate in environments which are not ready, are not for them. Let me use, I will try to be very polite now. The situation that we are facing now in the world about migration and displacement is calling our attention in the way that in some cases, the military bodies are playing a role or are forced to play a role from the security perspective. From the humanitarian perspective, it's very sensitive. I don't want to go in detail, but my main point, we need to increase the awareness and the understanding of the realities and trends, okay? And to clarify who is doing what and who could be in the best position. Because sometimes it's not about money or assets. It's about the sensitivity that we hermanas, you got my point. Thank you. And thank you for inviting us. All the best.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. So now next to Craig, please.
Well, this is a very broad subject. I think it goes back to what is the constitutional construct, the laws, the process of paying, but also the historical context. And I'm going to not cover about international response. I'm going to focus on domestic. Anytime the military is deployed domestically, we have to understand our history and culture of that military's role in society. And that, in many cases, will dictate what they can and cannot do, regardless of what the statutes say. I think logistics and humanitarian support is one of the most easy thresholds for the military to meet without getting into the security missions. The security missions, or when you're using the military to use force against your own population, is the most highest threshold, highest risk. And I think these are the things we need to plan for and understand the rules of engagement. As David will tell you, in the United States, a lot of this was shaped by our wars. The Civil War and the aftermath of Reconstruction severely limits the federal military and law enforcement activities because of experiences after the war. So while the U.S. seems to use the military quite frequently, I think you have to understand there are extreme limits on what the military in the United States are allowed to do domestically that would not apply to them in an international humanitarian response. So I think it always goes back to the history and context of the military and civilian life is going to be an also very key factor for decision makers to understand the best way to apply the military and understand the risk goes up the more we move away from the humanitarian and logistical support into any type of activity seen as law enforcement or security against their own citizens. That increases your risk.
Thank you so much. And next to Jorgos, please.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, I could not agree more with Craig, and I think we have to make that clear. It's only about logistics or a response to natural, as we call them, disasters or whatever, or human-made disasters for that particular element. Of course, there are gray zones. Occasionally it can be abused by regimes or militaries that want to do something wrong. But I mean, in established democratic societies, we have to keep that in mind and make sure we don't break any of those rules. But I think it's an opportunity to inspire also young professionals in the military career with that as an option of helping and being heroic in the context of addressing emergencies, that more and more of which we are going to see. So I think they should be prepared for that. And they should also get skills that, like, veterans can use afterwards for their own life, especially even for a conscript service like I did my military service. I was not a professional soldier, and I didn't happen to be involved in any emergency of that sort. But if it were done, I would like to learn something out of it, or, the professionals that they can use afterwards, even in the civilian lives. So I can see a growth industry of sorts in a good way here, as long as we have clear rules and we start from resilience, et cetera, locally. We don't overdo it. We don't bring it in just to make a point all the time. And of course, we see how resources are used and who does what in an organized way. Yeah, just a joke, of course. This must have been sponsored by Belgium, because about the waffles discussion was very Belgian for me. And thank you for that part. I will always remember that example. Thank you.
We'll go eat after this. So finally, Nicos is our last remarks, please.
I would also agree with Greg and Jorgos that the non-military use of the armed forces should be specifically defined. The internal security is not the task that should the military get involved. As we say, in the European Union, it's different defense from security. Military are in defense, security is other bodies. And I will repeat what I mentioned before. I believe that the development of specialized units, that they will be proper equipped and better training for assisting the civilian structures in disasters. It would be very helpful to take full advantage from the military use. The mass use of armed forces has not real added value. We need to invest in specialized units, equipped and trained with the right mandate. So, thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. And I can say it's been such a delight to interview with you all and now have this conversation today. I've been so lucky. So thank you all so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Peter now to conclude.
Yes, so on behalf of Jorgos and the executive board from VOGS, I'd like to thank all of our distinguished panelists for their time, not only for today, but also their work in looking at our background paper and also the interviews and the invaluable information they've given to us all. I think it's been mentioned here that this is probably just hopefully the start of many discussions and many follow-ups. And we hope that through this event, we can build up a network and a community of those that want to take this topic forward, and would definitely welcome also our viewers to get in contact with us and follow up if they're interested in this topic more. And we'll definitely keep our community up to date. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists and also some of my colleagues who've been working behind the scenes. Manan, Mauro, Daniel and Dasha, they know who they are and what they've done. Thank you to them as well, and to Lauren and Yvonne for a great moderation. So I wish you all a pleasant evening, afternoon or morning, wherever you may be, and may you all take care of yourself. Thank you very much.